Tom, thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Thank you for not being late. And by the way, it's 7 best-selling books, not 6, so just to make sure we have it right.
Thank you.
I want to start, Tom, in your most recent book, you have this fascinating chart that charts the acceleration of technological progress. It's sort of Moore's law, hockey stick growth, and then puts against that the adaptability of human institutions, which advances at a much slower rate. And it shows that we're now where those lines are colliding. Can you talk about that?
Sure. That actually came from Astro Teller, who runs Google X, and I was out, this was like 3 years ago now, researching my latest book, Thank You for Being Late, with Astro, and just talking about my ideas, and he went over and grabbed 3 magic markers and went over to his whiteboard. And first he drew a line across the middle that had a slightly positive slope over time. And I said, what's that, Astro? He said, that's the average rate at which human beings and communities adapt to change over time.
Sort of evolution.
Right. And it has a positive rate, a positive slope, we know, but it's very gradual. Then he took another magic marker and he started well below that line. It was very flat at first. This was the line of technological change. That's because back in the 16th or the 12th century, your bow and arrow didn't get better over a whole century. There was no bow and arrow 2.0, in the 13th century after the 12th century. So the line was very flat. But then you got the scientific revolution, Copernicus, Galileo, and then eventually you got Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Intel, and the line starts to slope and it eventually starts to go straight north. And then he drew a little X on that technology line, which was about a 1/4 inch above the adaptation line. And I said, what's that X, Astro? And he said, that's where we are. Yeah. We're at a point now where the pace of technological change is above the average rate at which human beings and societies can adapt. And then he got his 3rd magic marker out, and he drew a little dotted line from the adaptation line to meet the technology line where it is. And I said, what's that, Astro? He said, that's learning faster and governing smarter. And that's the challenge for every society today.
But to be honest, if you look at the recent trends, it doesn't feel like we're learning faster and governing smarter. It feels like we may be going in the opposite direction.
I don't know what you mean, Alan.
That wasn't intended to be a political comment, but yeah. You can. I mean, it's even true if you. At Fortune, we spend a lot of time looking at corporations, and every corporate leader you talk to talks about the accelerating rate of change. But then there was a study done by the CED last year that showed decision-making within corporations has slowed down.
I can believe that.
Because decisions have become more complex and you have matrix hierarchies and more people need to be at the table in order to make the decision. So human institutions not only aren't doing what Astro Teller suggested, in some ways they seem to be going in the opposite direction. Well,
not all. So like the way I like to put it is, since a lot of my thinking is based on biomimicry, I like to put it in biological terms. I think we're actually in the middle of 3 climate changes at once. We're in the middle of the change of the climate of the climate. We're going from what I call later to now. So when I was growing up in Minnesota in the 50s, later was when I could clean that river, purify that lake, rescue that orangutan. I could do it now or I could do it later. Today, later is officially over. Later will now be too late. So whatever you're going to save, please save it now. That's a climate change. I think we're going through a change in the climate of globalization. We're going from a world that was interconnected to a world that's interdependent. It's a very different world. You get a geoeconomic inversion in an interdependent world because your friends start to be able to kill you faster than your enemies. So if Greek and Italian banks had gone under last night, this room would be half full. Wait a minute, Greece, Italy, they're in NATO, they're in the EU, they're allies. In an interdependent world, they can kill us. And in an interdependent world, your rivals falling actually becomes more dangerous than your rivals rising. So if China had taken 6 more islands in the South China Sea last night, personally, don't tell anybody, couldn't care less. Had China lost 6% growth last night, this room would be empty. So China falling is so much more dangerous to us than China rising in an interdependent world. And lastly, we're going through a change in the climate of technology. Machines today are acquiring all the attributes of human beings, the ability to think, reason, manipulate, and learn. No member of our species, the human species, has ever lived in a world where machines could think, learn, analyze, and manipulate the way they are today. So we're in the middle of 3 climate changes at once. Well, what do you want when the climate changes? What do you need? Well, you want 2 things. You want resilience need to be able to take a blow, because stuff happens when the climate changes. But you also want propulsion. You want to be able to move ahead. You want to be curled up in a ball into your bed waiting for the climate change to pass. So as I thought about that, I thought, who do I go to for advice on how you get resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? And then I realized I knew this woman. She's 3.8 billion years old. Her name was Mother Nature, and she dealt with more climate changes than anybody. So I made an appointment. I called her up, made an appointment, went out to see her. And I
That's
sat
one of
down.
the great things about being Tom
Being
Friedman.
the New York Times, you can call Mother Nature even, you know. And she basically, I go through this in the book, I'm not going to recite it all now, but talked about how she adapts. Because when the climate changes, it's not the strongest that survive, it's not the smartest that survive, it's the most adaptive that survive. And I basically describe her tools for doing it. So we actually are in the middle of a giant adaptation challenge. Just to make one final point on this, at the individual level, Alan, at the community level, and at the corporate level. And what I believe is going on today is all national governments, most, not all, around the world, are too paralyzed politically by political tribalism to adapt at the pace of change. The single family, on the other end, is too weak to adapt to these changes. And I believe the right governing unit for the 21st century is the healthy community. That, and so the communities that are thriving are those that are creating what I call complex adaptive coalitions based on complex adaptive systems in nature that are...
Okay, we'll get back to the community, but I want to talk a little bit about the individuals and the corporations and the political piece, first of all, before we get there. So on individual, you talk about this climate change, the one that involves technology and the changes in technology. There's been a lot of talk here over the last couple of days about the training and education needs that puts on our society. We're not equipped to deal with that. How do we make people adaptable enough to deal with this incredibly rapid pace of change?
Well, the key adaptation mechanism, the big change, is that when an old fuddy-duddy like me, was growing up, I thought you went to college for 4 years, or in my case, 6 years, and then you dined out on that knowledge for the next 30 years. That is so 1950s. Today, the only way you thrive in the middle of 3 climate change is through lifelong learning. So you actually have schools now like the Ross Business School at the University of Michigan, which is raising money for scholarships, so their students, when they come into that school, will have access to permanent education from that school.
So it's like a lifelong contract with the school.
Yeah, and that's why one of my teachers on education, Heather McGowan, likes to say today, Mom, Dad, never ask your kids what you want to be when you grow up, because whatever it is not going to be here unless it's policeman or fireman. Only ask your kids today how you want to be when you grow up.
Tom,
will you be a lifelong learner?
But that's one school. I mean, this is, as you point out, this is on us today.
Yeah,
that's what education should be today, and it's not.
Well, what the best companies are doing, and I profile AT&T's human resources department in my book, they're actually going back into the training, lifelong learning business because they understand, this is going to be central. So, again, if we had our thinking caps on, if we were talking about this today as a government, we'd be sitting around thinking, what are the tax systems we can put in place that would incentivize every person and every company to be a lifelong learner? What would we be doing? And one of the things we would be doing, I believe, is making all post-secondary education tax-free. How can I tell you, Alan, you have to be a lifelong learner, but you're going to have to earn $50,000 to have the $25,000, or whatever, the $30,000 in order to pay the tuition. So it's those kind of adaptation mechanisms that should be at the center of our debate right now.
So let's go to the other side of the spectrum now and talk about why is it that national governments don't see that? I mean, that should be the focus of the national conversation, right?
Well, some do. I mean, 3 months ago, I was invited by the Prime Minister of Denmark to come over and address his whole cabinet because they have something there called the Disruption Council, which is all about how we, Denmark, disrupt ourselves. So some governments around the world really have their thinking caps on. Israel, Denmark, Singapore, Korea, they tend to be the smaller ones that are really the first to feel the change. I have a motto in life, Alan, which is that wherever there's oil, there's trouble. Wherever there's oil, there's trouble.
Does that go for natural gas?
Well, because what any natural resource does is insulate you from the need to adapt. And so you find that all the systems that are adapting first, they're all these very slow systems that understand they have an advantage if they're always looking to drill their people and unlock their energy, creativity, and talent, women and men, and not drill the ground. And there's a reason the Middle East is an outlier region today, all the others, because they're cursed by oil.
But talk about how the U.S. fits into that spectrum.
So we have a little both, yeah. I mean, right now, I believe if you want to be an optimist about America today, stand on your head. Because the country looks so much better from the bottom up than from the top down, I can tell you. The cliche about America is that we're a country divided between two coasts that are liberalizing, pluralizing, diversifying, and modernizing. And in the middle is flyover America, where everyone's high on opioids, voted for Trump, and waiting for 1950 to come back. That is the cliche, okay? Well, you only have to be from flyover America, Minnesota in my case, a small town outside of Minneapolis, to know that ain't true. In fact, the country is divided between communities that are building complex adaptive coalitions and rising from the bottom up, and communities that are failing to do that and are unfortunately collapsing. The country's actually a checkerboard of these communities. Now, on the 4th of July, I wrote about one of them, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that in the 1990s was a dying city, and in February, one of your competitors, Forbes magazine, named Lancaster one of the 10 coolest cities in America. And I talked about how they built a complex adaptive coalition where leaders without authority, as my teacher Giddy Greenstein calls them, community leaders without authority, these are the most important people in the country today, step up and they build a coalition between business, educators, philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, and local government to create a mechanism that is adaptive and fast enough to keep up with the pace of change. But you got Lancaster here, and you got York, Reading, and Harrisburg, and they're falling off the face of the map. Yeah. So you can see where these leaders without authority emerge, they take off, and where they don't, they are falling off the map.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of the private sector in that? Because as we were talking about backstage, one of the things that we're seeing at Fortune these days is that with the collapse of national governments in some areas, you see more and more private sector leaders stepping up and saying, okay, we'll carry the climate change banner. We will take on diversity, inclusion issues. We had a great conversation in this room yesterday about some of the challenges the tech industry faces. We find more and more business leaders saying, we can expand the reach of our powers beyond just the bottom line of our corporation.
It's very important, and the best ones, and again, in my book, I profiled the Itasca project in Minneapolis, which I think is the mother of all complex adaptive coalitions, and you see the business community in the Twin Cities really taking the lead on training, leadership, skill building, and diversity building. And it's very, where it's working, it works really well. The problem with it, having written about this a lot, is that it's very hard to scale, because at the core of it is this really intangible thing called leadership. And you can't just mint it, you can't just call for it. It emerges in some places, again, these what Giddy calls, leaders without authority, and it doesn't emerge in others. And Alan, you and I have been in the news business all our lives. When there is a great newswoman or newsman heading your 2-person bureau, your 10-person bureau, or your 1,000-person newsroom, you're going to do well. And if my wife's a school teacher for many years, when you have a great principal, the difference that leadership makes, and you pull that principal out and you put another one that's not great in, you pull that editor out, and one person can destroy a whole organization.
It's a really,
or a country.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting point, because it gets to this. We'll get to that. It gets to this. It gets to this key thesis, which is in this a challenging era we're in, where the change is being driven by technology. The challenge is really a human challenge. It's how do we create people? How do we create the leaders who can drive what needs to happen to the human system?
And that's the point I made about Lancaster. This was not about microchips. It's all about relationships. And the reason my book is called Thank You for Being Late, the title comes from meeting people in Washington, D.C. for breakfast over the years. I don't like to waste breakfast if I'm downtown eating by myself. I like to be learning from someone, so I schedule a lot of business breakfasts. And every once in a while, someone would come 10, 15 minutes late. And they'd say, Tom, I'm really sorry. Is the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. And 3 years ago, one of those energy entrepreneur, Peter Corcel, came 15 minutes late, said, Tom, I'm really sorry. He's aware of the traffic, the subway, the dog, get my homework. And I just spontaneously said to him, actually, Peter, thank you for being late. Because you were late, I've been eavesdropping on their conversation. Fascinating. I've been people watching the lobby. Fantastic. But best of all, I just connected two ideas I've been struggling with for a month. So thank you for being late. And my teacher, Dov Seidman, likes to say, you know, when you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, it starts. That's when it starts to reflect, rethink, and reimagine. So the subtext of my book is that the faster the world gets, the more everything old and slow matters more than ever. Good parent to good child, good teacher to good student, good pastor to good flock, good bureaucrat to good citizen. I'm not a huge fan of social networks, as some of you may have read. You know, I won't go into it, but let's just say I actually am here to celebrate everything old and slow. Because if you haven't built the internal software into your kids and citizens, which is something that has to be done by good parent to good child, good teacher to good student, good preacher to good flock, good bureaucrat to good citizen, we're all interacting with each other nakedly now. And one thing I can tell you about the internet, it is an open sewer of untreated, unfiltered information. Oh, it is full of diamonds, rubies, and gold nuggets, and it's full of rusty nails, broken glass, and toxic waste. And if you haven't built the internal filters into your citizens and kids to separate one from the other, we're going to have a real problem, and you can see that every single day in the newspaper.
Tom, that last comment aside, what I like so much about talking to you and reading you is your optimism. But
I use a lot of drugs. Don't tweet that. That's just a joke.
But having said that, you wrote this week one of the most pessimistic columns, after watching the Putin press conference, one of the most pessimistic columns I've read in a long time. Can you talk about that?
Well, you know, let's go back to the main thesis for a second, Alan. When the world is fast, small errors in navigation have huge consequences. It's like a 7-4. You know, when we just needed to go 50 miles at 5 miles an hour, if we had a bad leader, you got 5 miles off track. It was very easy and rather painless to get back on track. Whether you're talking about business, a city, a church, or the United States government, when you need to go 50,000 miles at 5,000 miles an hour, and you get off track, you can get so far off track that the pain of coming back on track can be enormous. It's like a 747 pilot who just transposes two numbers and entering his navigation data. And that's what worries me about this moment. Look, you read my column, you know, there was no good time for Donald Trump to be president. This is a uniquely bad time when all of this change is going on. And
so the implications
and I think
what happened.
The performance that he put on with Putin and the whole thing of would or wouldn't, well, it's just a total crap. You know, I mean, this man is either so morally deformed that his head is just a set of mirrors all reflecting on him, and he simply can't see out of that. Or he is compromised in some way. I can't tell you what. But the performance he put on, the authoritarian envy he displayed, was, I think, unique in the annals of American history. You know, my view is very simple. I think Trump came in unhinged but bound. That was what his first year was about. I think his second year is about unhinged and unbound. And I think years 3 and 4 are going to be about the unintended consequences of this. Now, mind you, I happen to believe some things are true even if Donald Trump believes them. So, you know, there are things that he is doing on China, on the economy, that, you know, I pay very close attention to. And I'm not here to tell you it's all going to end terribly, but I am here to tell you that there are going to be unquintended consequences to all of this.
So I successfully knocked you off your optimism streak. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, it takes a lot.
Any questions or comments? Clay.
Hey, Tom.
Hey.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by your comment about China and Trump's policies there. Do you agree with them? And if so, can you expound on it?
Sure. I happen to, and I've written this, I happen to agree with the president 100%. And I put my money where my mouth is. I've supported him on this with one caveat, and it's about the strategy. So let me put it in the larger context and why I agree with the president. I believe China got rich over the last 30 years with hard work, delayed gratification, smart investments in infrastructure, smart investments in education, and cheating on WTO rules, non-reciprocal trade relations, stealing intellectual property, and you can go right down the list. So it's a combination of both those things. Now, they use that combination to basically, metaphorically speaking, get rich around tennis shoes, T-shirts, and solar panels. If we let them use that same formula on AI, supercomputing, biotechnology, new materials, aerospace, we're going to have a real problem. It is just not on for me that Tencent and Alibaba can have their own web server in Silicon Valley, and Amazon.com and Microsoft cannot have their own in the Pearl River Delta. That's just not on with me, you know. So
that deserves a.
And so I agree that we have. This is a really, if I think it's geoeconomically the most important thing in the world to address. But how would I do it? Well, first, I think what I would do is I'd try to put together a 12-nation free trading bloc built around my interests and values. I think I might even call it the Trans-Pacific Partnership, okay? That would control 40% of global GDP, okay? First, I'd get them on my side, okay? Then I would go to the European Union and say, well, I can tell you, I know to be true, you guys have the exact same problem with China as we do. And the Chinese have actually come to the EU and said, whatever you do, you must not align with the Americans. And then what I'd do is I'd say, forget steel and aluminum tariffs. We have a much bigger fish to fry. So I want you on my other side. Then I'd call the Chinese and say, you send 5 guys to Hainan Island. I'm going to send 5 guys to negotiate to Hainan Island. We're going to do all this in secret. No one's going to get embarrassed. We're not going to get in your face, okay? Do all this in secret. And we're both going to come out. It's going to be win-win. But privately, I'm going to show up with 80% of global GDP. And we are going to go after you with more leverage than you have ever confronted in world trade ever. What did Trump do? Blew up TPP, blew up relations with the EU, and did all of it in public, making it a face issue for the Chinese. That's just stupid. That's why I said this morning, there's a method to Trump's madness, but there's sheer madness to his method, okay? All right?
By the way, I've already been working on time to come to Yunnan to the Fortune Global Sustainability Forum in September. So corner him on the way out the door, and we'll pin that one down. What was there someone else who had a question or a comment? Please. Over there? No, right here. Go ahead, Adam.
Tom, with apologies to all the journalism you've done for the last 30 years, From Beirut to Jerusalem is still one of my favorite nonfiction books ever.
Thank you.
So with the little time that we have left, tell us your forecast for the Middle East.
Really good, good question. So I tend to look at the Middle East at a lot of different levels. One is I'm a big believer that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict, is to the wider war of civilization what off-Broadway is to Broadway. So I always study it very closely, okay? Airline hijacking started there, went to Broadway. Suicide bombing started there, went to Broadway. The effort to build the other into an alternative I can negotiate with, they called it Oslo, we called it Iraq, went to Broadway. The wall went to Broadway. Then individual attacks, lone wolves, Palestinians going to the kitchen, taking out a knife, stabbing an Israeli, or driving into Israelis at bus stops, started there and went to Broadway. So I'm always watching what's going on off-Broadway. It's just the mini version of the global struggle of civilization. So what you see are several trends there. One, Israel has built a complex adaptive organism. The Arab world is still stuck basically drilling the ground in macro, so the gap between them is just getting wider and wider. That's sort of one trend you can really see there. The second is that I predicted in January that there was going to be a war in Syria between Iran and Israel, and 2 months later it came and Israel won. It's been a very quiet thing because it happened so fast. But the Israeli Air Force devastated the IRCG in Syria in a way that really drove home to the Iranians how overextended they are. And when I was the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem in the 80s, when I was writing Beirut to Jerusalem, the New York Times had a military analyst named Drew Middleton, very famous. He covered D-Day. And he wrote military analysis for us. And he came to Israel once to do a profile of the Israeli army. And I had dinner with him. I said, Drew, what do you think of the Israeli army? He said, Tommy, my boy, until you fought the Germans, you haven't fought anybody. And until you fought the Israeli Air Force, you haven't fought anybody. And that's what the Iranians have discovered, that the Israelis have built a platform of intelligence, technology, and air power that is not like fighting al-Nusra in Aleppo. And so this has been a very quiet story in the region, but it's had huge ripple effects. Because, by the way, there are a lot of people around President Rouhani who really love seeing Soleimani get his brains being beaten out in Syria. And if you watch almost every week now, the Iranians land a plane at 5 in Damascus airport with missiles, and the Israelis blow it up at 6. So they're so penetrated. Now, this is coming in a context of Iran's currency having been devastated, down 30%, over the last year, and now Trump's sanctions. So something's going to break there. I don't know what exactly. One thing about Trump, I will say to his benefit and detriment, he's not afraid to exercise power. So just taking away the Iran deal, I mean, it's had a huge impact on Iran. But again, one of my fears about Trump is that he never thinks about the morning after the morning after. What is our goal? Is it to change Iran? Is it to moderate Iran? Or is it to turn Iran into Syria? Because if you think we have a refugee problem in Europe today, if Iran collapses into civil strife, the numbers will be staggering, and the pressure on the EU will be even more staggering.
Boy, I have really taken you off the optimism track. All right.
It's free in this
Tom
state,
Friedman,
isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.